Today I'm going to talk about what is it that we can do to make micromobility safe, what can we do to make it safer. And I'm going to describe some of the work that I've helped lead in my day job at the International Transport Forum at the OECD, although probably may not know this, I took time off to come here on my holiday to give this talk. So talking about safe micromobility. Now, clearly, we all know that micromobility has a lot to contribute to urban areas, not just as a first and last kilometer connection to public transport, but as a way of getting around, that makes us feel happy, that helps cities function better, that is a real contribution to making livability in our urban areas a reality. But it has to be safe, and I'm going to go straight to the end right now and give you the 3 takeaways, and then I'll go into developing them a bit more in the remaining 9 minutes. The first is that from what we can see when we look around the world at the data that's available, micromobility is becoming safer. And when I talk about micromobility, I'm talking about shared and owned. I'm talking about devices that aren't like bicycles but are small, and of course bicycles and e-bikes as well. The other thing is that when we think about what are the factors that really contribute to making micromobility safer, and it's going to be infrastructure, of course, and it's also going to be vehicle design. And the final thing that is one of the main messages that has been already brought up a few times here today is that traffic speed matters. Ambient traffic speed matters. The environment in which people are riding really does matter. And that is somewhere where we can really de-risk a lot of the danger that is currently in the micromobility environment. So how to assess micromobility safety? We don't start with the safety aspect. We start up here with the health aspect. And that's important because micromobility safety is a component of how micromobility contributes to health. When it is unsafe, health outputs are diminished. When it is safe, health outputs are increased. But the crash safety component is not the only way in which some forms of micromobility improve health. Active mobility, when it comes to either e-bikes or bicycles, have this added component in that they make us healthier. That doesn't mean they're better than some of the non-active modes of micromobility. Those modes make it easier to live in cities without cars, and that is valuable in and of itself. But when we're talking about health, the active component does really matter. Then we talk about, well, what is the safety profile of micromobility? And in order to discuss the safety profile, we have to have an understanding of the crash mechanism. So what kinds of crashes are taking place, and what are the contributing factors, infrastructure, users, and vehicles. The first thing I can say, I've hinted it just earlier, is that not all forms of micromobility provide the same benefits. Active mobility, electric assisted or not, provides that health benefit. Non-active micromobility provides these other kinds of benefits, but that don't really relate to health. So that's an important thing to keep in mind from a public policy perspective. Where is the danger? Well, we've heard about this already when we look at the kinds of crashes that take place. This is from 2019, but the data is consistent year after year. These operators and riders were killed in crashes with these types of vehicles. And what you see is that not this space. This is not where the danger is. It's this space. This is the space where cars are running into cyclists, cars are causing crashes, heavy lorries are causing crashes in a number of different scenarios, left turn, right turn, etc. So the danger is in this system, but the danger is also over here, self-crashes for cars, but also self-crashes for micromobility. And I'll come back to that. When we try to assess crash risk, we have to have an idea of the number of crashes and an exposure to relativize that crash. So it can be trips, it can be number of kilometers traveled. What we can say is that shared micromobility operations give us the best data that we have both on crashes and on exposure. And so we have some fairly robust findings from shared micromobility operators. But that's a minority of all the micromobility action that's taking place. And so one key finding is that we really do need to be much better in collecting exposure data for all micromobility devices, all micromobility uses. What we can say is that looking at shared mobility operators in Europe, we've seen a 30% decrease in casualty risk, so serious injury and death in Europe from 2021 to 2024. And there's some other issues that come up in this kind of data, which is just the shared micromobility operated data, that are not necessarily matched by a greater analysis of all micromobility data such as we have it. For example, in the shared micromobility operator data, we see that the casualty risk for e-bikes is higher than the casualty risk for e-scooters. That isn't the finding that we find for all of micromobility. It may have something to do with the types of e-bikes they're using, but it also may have something to do as to where their e-scooter riders are riding. Most crashes involving micromobility are minor injury crashes. The severe injuries and fatalities are a small proportion of all crashes. Most e-crashes, e-scooter and bicycle-related crashes involve the rider, their self-crashes, and no other users. And fatal micromobility crashes involve a motor vehicle. Those are key takeaways when we look at the micromobility crashes. But when we look at the kinds of crashes and the kind of injuries, we see a difference between e-scooters and bicycles. E-scooter riders experience a greater share of head, face, and neck injuries, and jaw injuries in particular. Also, lower limb injuries. And one of the explanations for that is riders jumping off of e-scooters right before or during a crash. Bicycle riders also have a high exposure risk for head injuries, less so than e-scooter riders, possibly because they're wearing more helmets in general, but also upper extremity injuries because they're falling, holding onto the handlebars, whereas a lot of e-scooter riders are vaulting over the handlebar. The handlebar and the handlebar shaft serves as a fulcrum, especially for front injury scenarios, front crash scenarios. The point about infrastructure is when I cannot underscore enough. And it's both the provision of infrastructure, of connected network, but also the quality of that network. 30 to 40% of e-scooter crashes are related to infrastructure. When it comes to riders, there are a number of factors that we also have to be aware of. Reduced lighting is important. Alcohol impairment, a huge issue. When it comes to helmet wearing, there is a greater incidence of helmet wearing for bicycle riders than for e-scooter riders, and that leads to the severity of the crashes, but that doesn't mean that mandatory helmet rules are the answer. Better infrastructure and better protection and lower speeds is the answer to reduce that. The other thing that is really important from what we saw in the injury descriptions are the kinds of crashes that e-scooter riders have are not necessarily going to be the kinds of to be protected from by traditional bicycle helmets. And we see that for fast e-scooters, and there's something about the evolution of helmet standards for e-scooting. Riding 2 or 3 on a scooter is a big crash risk, and inexperienced riders, of course, a clear risk. We see a significant number of e-scooter riders, but first-time e-bike riders as well are a source of a large number of incidents, not necessarily the fatal ones, because it's slower speeds at which they crash. The vehicles. Again, we're going to talk about different types of vehicles, and this is a generalization, but what we can see is that when we look at the safety characteristics of vehicles, there are differences between e-scooters and with bicycles, and they have to do with 3 issues in particular. One is the head height to ground. So in a crash scenario, there's a higher acceleration of the head towards the ground for e-scooter riders because their head is above, higher than the bicycle rider's head. The second one is the role of the handlebar as a fulcrum for e-scooters versus the role of the handlebar in a bicycle as a device that you hold on to into the crash, leading to the kinds of injuries that I described earlier. And the last one has to do with wheel size. And the gyroscopic effect of the wheels, which provides stability for bicycles, but the gyroscopic effect of the wheel that provides the ability to ride over obstacles is really linked not only to the gyroscope, to the speed, but also to the size of the wheel. And so smaller wheels are more unstable, certainly in crash scenarios where you're being deflected, the front wheel's being deflected, or when you're running into an obstacle. But what I can say is that the shared micromobility fleet when it comes to e-scooters is probably the safest fleet in terms of vehicle design, and the industry has been a real leader in providing these safety features: larger wheels, lower and more anterior weight, different types of platforms that are wider. All of these first came out in the shared micromobility fleet. And what we can say, shared e-scooter fleet, and what we can say is that we don't see that yet in owned e-scooters that are significantly less safe in general than most of these devices that are out there. So some top takeaways. These aren't the only takeaways, but the first one is that we have this work to do to improve our data collection to understand the real risk that micromobility poses. The second one is there's this role for public authorities to develop, to build, to establish, and to maintain safe, connected, coherent micromobility networks and or slow-speed areas in cities. There is this countervailing need to think about when and where it makes sense to put in place low speed limits for micromobility vehicles, not just e-scooters, not just the ones that are commercially shared, but all micromobility devices in certain parts of the city. And that makes sense in zones, not necessarily on linear tracks. Enforcement actions against all types of those traffic participants contravening traffic rules are important, not just for micromobility, but for the car drivers as well. And rider education, especially for e-scooters, because this is not something that people are learning yet. They're learning, well, maybe less so now, but the first time that many first-time e-scooter riders come into contact with an e-scooter is as an adolescent or young adult, not as a child, which is different from bicycles. And finally, the need to put in place universal technical safety requirements. They should be performance-based, but performance-based requirements for the safety of these vehicles, e-scooters, bicycles, and other form factors that are evolving. On operators, there's this need, but I think that's fairly well established now, in practice to maintain their fleets. And the last one is to think about where it makes sense and how to implement geofencing. And the last thing I'll say here before closing is we have heard a lot of talk about geofencing, and there are aspects of geofencing that are really good, but it should never only be for the least dangerous vehicles in the traffic mix. It should also extend to cars and trucks. Thank you very much.